and thank you very much to all of today's presenters for sharing your time and expertise. On that note, let's go to the first speaker. Part of what brings us together as a community is that we all want research evidence to help public policy. We all care that social research has a role in policy impact. It's an enduring concern, but one that we need to understand in today's context as well. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome Stian Westlake to share his thoughts on that topic. Stian is the Executive Chair of the Economic Social Research Council, and through his career, he's had many different vantage points on this topic. Before the ESRC, where he joined in June last year, he served as the Chief Executive of the Royal Statistical Society, a friend of ours, was an Executive Director in Policy Research at Nesta, was an advisor to 3 UK science ministers, and has done managing consulting in McKinsey as well. His research interests primarily include economics and the politics of innovation, research and technology, and he's a regular commentator on science and policy. He's also co-authored fantastic books, Restarting the Future, How to Fix the Intangible Economy, and Capitalism Without Capital, The Rise in the Intangible Economy. So Stian, welcome. We're delighted to have you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Rosie, for that introduction, and thank you all for inviting me here to be here on this wonderful day. As someone who used to run a membership society, I'm in awe of this conference. You've got a fantastic venue, a fantastic group of attendees, and a great day for it. So I really wish you the best for today. I did want to begin with a bit of a pre-election period notice, because you'll notice that the topic that I've got on this slide here is slightly different from the promised topic in the programme for the conference. I think it's worth reflecting a little bit, as many of us are involved in this world in various ways, on pre-election period restrictions in general. One thing that I've been at pains to say in my role as ESRC Executive Chair is, first of all, that we should be very clear about what is and isn't allowed from a pre-election period guidance. The social sciences and social research in general are vitally important to the public discussion of politics and of policy, and as a result, I think it's very important to make sure that we don't inadvertently gold plate these pre-election period restrictions. One, I think, particularly important thing is that they don't apply, the Cabinet Office rules don't apply to researchers form independent organisations, and that's something I think I've been really trying to make a point about this election. I think people like Fiona Fox from the Science Media Centre have done a fantastic job in previous years of really making the case for that. And it's important because what you all do and what we do is important, and it should be out there in the public debate. Nevertheless, I'm obviously a public employee and work for a public body, so I am governed by the rules. And although I'm very keen to be here and speak today, I'm trying to make sure that I stay within the spirit of 2 of the particular rules. The first of which is that we are not meant to compete for attention with elected politicians or people standing for election. So if anyone was planning to go and listen to some MPs speaking today, please just ignore me, get out your phone, read some manifestos, engage with the democratic process. I don't want to get in your way. More seriously, we're not meant to use public resources to do anything political, which I think is a very sensible prohibition. And as a result, I've slightly changed the title of the presentation so that rather than talking about policy priorities for the next Parliament, which obviously has some political implications, I'm aiming to talk more generally about social research and policy impact, which is a topic dear to my heart and I'm sure to yours. So with that in mind, I just wanted to give a little bit of a reflection on the history of policy impact and how it fits into how we conceive the social sciences. And I wanted to start with this great social researcher, Michael Young, who many of us will have engaged with in one way or another. I used to work for the Young Foundation, the successor organisation of Michael Young's Institute for Community Studies. He was, of course, the founder of the Social Science Research Council, the precursor of the Economic and Social Research Council, 59 years ago. It's our 60th anniversary next year, and indeed of many other social research organisations, some of whom I imagine are represented in the room today. I think what was particularly important about Michael Young's conception of social science, coming as it did at the foundation of what became the ESRC, was that impact was baked in it from the start. So especially when I deal with social scientists and academia, there is sometimes a perception that impact is something that has been a kind of recent imposition by government or by funding bodies on the social sciences, which is certainly is interesting from a reflection on recent political developments, but it's very ahistorical when we think about the development of the social sciences. This was absolutely baked into the vision of social research that Michael Young envisaged in the 1940s when he was pitching for the argument that the public sector should fund social sciences, and in the 1960s when the Social Science Research Council was established. So I think I would start by saying impact is absolutely core to what we do, and it's absolutely core to what it means for the government to support and fund social research. It's absolutely vital. I'm quite optimistic in some ways about where this agenda has gone in recent years. If I think back over the last 30 years, we've obviously seen an explosion of popular social science in journalism, in online discourse, in the books that we pick up at airports from time to time. That's had its downsides. It's kind of brought the replication crisis to bear on a lot of the public debate, and we found that there were a lot of popularized ideas that turned out not to be as rigorous as we thought. But in a sense, that's been extremely valuable. And certainly when I look at political debate at the moment, I find it really refreshing that you see former civil servants, current members of parliament or members of parliament before the dissolution, arguing online with one another in public about social science data on important topics like migration, for example. I think this is a good thing. I think it's also very exciting when I look at the potential list of people who might be joining the next parliament, that we have a lot of social scientists, one way or another, represented in that group. So I think we're going to see a growing attention to impact in this area. So what I then wanted to reflect on, from our point of view as producers of social research, what are some of the routes to policy impact that we might have? And I wanted to talk about a few that we were involved in at ESRC that many of you will be involved in directly in various ways. The most obvious one is the commissioning of social research by public bodies, by other organisations that do policy one way or another. The government spends, I think, about £3 or £4 billion on commissioning R&D on its own account at the moment, as 2022. It's quite hard to work out how much of that is social science, but I reckon by looking through the data about 10%. So you're talking about £300, £400 million of social research one way or another commissioned directly by government departments on its own account each year. That's effectively 1.5 or 2 ESRCs in their own rights. This is clearly a really important area. And, you know, it's seen hugely important work. So when I was working in government, we were very involved with the production and consumption of the longitudinal education outcomes data set and what that told us about higher education at a time when the public policy debate on higher education, this was under when Theresa May was Prime Minister, was very much shifting. And I would say as a consumer of that research, obviously there's still a lot of open questions in this area, but having some information on graduate outcomes built by synthesizing data sets and by doing good social research on the outcomes of those synthesized data set elevated the quality of policy debate by an order of magnitude. It was transformative in terms of the good sense it injected into the debates. A second area of important research, and obviously this is something ESRC is involved in funding a lot, is when we have a particular goal and we fund research towards that. One of our largest investment at the moment is a project called the Productivity Institute, which some of you will be involved in, based at the University of Manchester, trying to address the important question of what has happened to UK productivity and how it can be improved. And I think certainly bringing together experts towards a goal like that is a useful way of synthesizing across disciplines. There's been some really interesting co-working between economics and management studies, for example, in that area, which to sort of, I think, looking at it across it from the gamut of research disciplines, you might think those are very close to each other, but any of you who've worked in economics and management studies will realize that getting those two to work together is actually a little bit like the north poles of two magnets. So that's actually been quite a useful interaction. But interdisciplinarity to achieve goals is hugely significant. Similarly, we are quite interested in funding practice-oriented research, bringing to bear the skills of a particular methodology and approach on a set of problems. So a recent investment we made is called Behavioural Research UK, BR UK, jointly based at UCL and the University of Edinburgh. The project's been going for a few months recently, but a really interesting model because it brings together both sort of what you might think of as classic behavioural science, but also a whole range of allied social science disciplines with things to say about behaviour, with a really deep engagement in policy. So there are policy fellows working with departments looking at that. The PhD training scheme is planned to be quite integrated. And again, a really interesting way of bringing something that government is very interested in, how do we understand human behaviour, to a set of policy questions. So far, these things are all about kind of research, actually setting a research agenda and asking questions. But I think something that often gets neglected from the point of view of maybe our lookout in academic research is the importance of evidence synthesis. Very often what policymakers will want is not breakthrough research, but an understanding of where the state of the field is. What do we know? What do we not know? What might we know? And how can that be put together in a sensible way? So the What Works Centres, who were celebrating their 10th anniversary last year, are now sort of embarking on, well, what will the next 10 years look like, which I think is a really interesting conversation about what might happen in those areas. But I think they've done some really interesting work, not only in actually doing the evidence synthesis, which is obviously hugely important, but in understanding at a meta level what works when it comes to what works. How do you create evidence syntheses that people use? I think, so if I look, for example, at the work, some of the work that Foundations has done on dealing with how do you produce evidence that will be useful for people who work in social care contexts with younger people, or famously the work of the Education Endowment Fund in terms of creating evidence synthesis that school leaders and teachers find they can pick up and use. That's been a really important contribution. I think it's very exciting to see where the next 10 years will lead us there. So far, everything I've talked about has been about ideas, but people are just as important as well. We focus a lot at UKRI as a whole and at ESRC on how to create opportunities for researchers to move into practice, to come back, to bring their ideas with them. And it feels like this is an area where there is a lot has been done. There's a lot more to do. I think we've seen quite a lot of benefits from our policy fellows going into government and sharing ideas in the short term. I think in some ways I'm even more excited to see what the 10-year effect of this will be when we have cohorts of people who've spent a lot of time in government back in research environments spreading those messages. And I know this is something that's this audience has clearly a huge amount of experience of, and building those connections, building people who span that boundary between research and practical implementation of policy is hugely important. And then finally, I think we certainly try not to neglect the importance of data infrastructure and tools. ESRC, we spend about a quarter of our budget each year on investing in data infrastructure, pulling together administrative data, making it accessible to researchers. But these kind of tools are very important. Policymakers like them and can use them, and they allow, I think, some of the research agenda to be shared, to be done at a more appropriate time period. So it's a kind of an essential complement to some of these research things that we do. These are all things that we focus on, I think, a lot, but I think more generally they have an important contribution to make to maximising the policy impact of research. Now, in terms of thinking about what government's looking for, what the kind of customer demand is, in a sense, there's sort of two types of ways that I have looked at this in the past. One is to almost go with the structure of government, whether that's a departmental structure, a regional structure, or similar. And the other is to think about what government wants to achieve, its strategies, its missions, its goals, and so forth. And just to sort of take those two in turn and how that kind of works. Obviously, many of you work closely with government departments or even in government departments, and departments will have their own research questions. One of the things that we've tried to do at ESRC is to help government departments with their codification and linkage of those agendas. So many of you will be familiar with, or maybe even been involved in the drafting of these areas of research interest document where departments set out their research questions. It's important not to underestimate the challenge of putting these things together. It's very sensitive to admit that you don't know something in public policy, and especially in politics. And a lot of departments have really felt they've needed to be quite careful in how they express what their research needs are. But now these documents are out there, I think it's a huge opportunity for the world of social research to interact and to sort of to understand. So making that research demand a bit more legible, I think, has been really important. I'll say a little bit more about what we've been doing on that in a second. I think another really interesting dynamic from a research point of view that I think will probably be particularly relevant in the coming years is a place-based angle to social research needs. I think we're obviously, there's been a long-standing period of the development of various structures in regional government in the UK. We're now seeing increased empowerment of metropolitan combined authorities, some of which have now increasingly ambitious research agendas, and I would imagine that is only going to grow. Just looking, for example, at some of the things that we see in West Yorkshire, we've got a real investment in fascinating socially relevant data in the form of the Born in Bradford study, a really remarkable health and early years study. Organisations like Open Innovations that bring together stakeholders and data from across local government, business, local research, and really interesting mechanisms to try and turn that into policy action. So some of you will know the Bradford Education Alliance for Life Chances that's building on some of that data to try and turn that into something of an early years offering. So I think there's more opportunities there. I think there's also an opportunity for social researchers to work with metropolitan combined authorities, other local governments, to help them understand what social research can offer them. I mentioned a little bit about these areas of research interest, and I just want to put in a little plug for a tool that we've been developing. Some of you may have seen it, called the ARI, the Areas of Research Interest Navigator. What we effectively did was this takes all the areas of research interest documents that government have put together, puts them online, and has a little tool so that they can be searched thematically. Depending on the audience, I'll say it's an AI tool, but it's, you know, there's some statistics in it. But it's a tool that if you, for example, want to research on sustainable agriculture, for example, this will allow you to see who in government is interested in sustainable agriculture, which on the one hand will be DEFRA, but what's so interesting about the tool is you'll often find out that there'll be people interested, for example, in some aspect of the sociology of transport who aren't in the Department for Transport. And it really adds some opportunities to find people who are interested in research, to maximise the impact of what you've done, and to build connections as well. Interestingly, it allows us to sort of map our own research to different ARIs. So the vertical axes here represent the different councils that make up UK Research and Innovation, and we actually allowed us to map up the various grants that we had issued in the last few years against various research interests. So it's a tool for curating the knowledge that already exists and trying to make it useful, but also a tool for looking for research opportunities. We talked about departments and existing government structures as a framework, but obviously the other is missions and goals and specific things that government wants to accomplish in a more general sense. People use different words for them, but you know, there are a whole range of different interests in mission-oriented research. So in 2016, there were these grand challenges. There was an AI grand challenge, a mobility grand challenge, a kind of green technology grand challenge, and an aging society grand challenge. And although the 2016 government obviously came and went, a lot of those research projects carried on and flourished. I was actually at the closing event for a big healthy aging event a few months ago, and it was great to see the work that had led. And what was so interesting about that, it was incredibly multidisciplinary, applied, institutionally diverse, business, civil society, university research, policymakers, research towards the challenges of how do we create housing, services, businesses, civil society support suitable for an aging population. It was a kind of really inspiring example and a great example of how social research has a really unique role to play in addressing big mission-led questions. Similarly, at the moment, we have a UK science and technology framework that has a bunch of technology-led areas. Those all have really important social research elements as well. Labour Party are obviously talking about various missions to Britain, which have a kind of social component as well. And I think these offer a really interesting way to bring social research components, social research insights to a government perspective that is a slightly different approach from looking at what departments want. I think these are complementary approaches, taking a mission-led approach and looking at departments' research needs. But if we're thinking about how to maximise the benefits of research, they are both important. I wanted to sort of wind up by thinking about a few principles that lie behind all of these things. And these are certainly things that I've found useful in the research I've done in the past and as a consumer of research. I sort of wanted to talk about each of these one by one. Perhaps obviously, I would start by talking about rigour. The reason we do research is because we want to seek truth on some level, and we believe that research, careful analysis, qualitative, quantitative of what's going on can help improve decision making. So obviously anything we do has to be based on the premise that we are looking intellectually honestly, we're going to speak truth in our research, and at the same time, and I, as a former Royal Statistical Society person, this is very dear to my heart, that we are open about when we are certain and when we're not certain. So in some ways this is sort of preaching to the choir in an audience of social research, but I wouldn't want to let this go because all of what we do rests on a bedrock of a commitment to rigour. But I think if we want to have impact, there are other complementary things that matter too. The first challenge is what I've always thought of as the time inconsistency problem between a research agenda and what happens in public policy. Certainly when I deal with a lot of government directly commissioned research, we know there is a challenge between the time it takes to do a research project and the immediate needs of policymakers to do things. Part of sorting this out is effectively a process of feeling our way and of bricolage. When I think about the work that we did with the Institute of Fiscal Studies on the LEO data back in government, it was a mixture of being very clear from a government point of view about when decisions would be made and very clear communications on the part of the researchers about what it would be possible to say by when, and an acceptance that sometimes things would be impossible, that you couldn't always fit a quart into a pint pot. But clear communications, I think, formed the basis of that. At the same time, and this is something that, as engaged social researchers, you will know very well, I think acceptance of this varies across the communities of researchers I deal with, that there is a premium at times to doing something quickly, even if imperfectly, so long as we observe the first principle about being clear about how certain we are about something. And I think one of the things that has been quite encouraging, observing aspects of the discourse around public policy in recent years, is a willingness to debate data as it emerges and to try and generate clarity about things at the right time. But timeliness is clearly important if we want to affect things. The third thing that has certainly I've always found really important is the format of research. And the world doesn't necessarily need another journal article, important though journals are to what we do. I think there's been a really refreshing move, especially from, in both quantitative and qualitative social research, towards alternative forms of research output, in some cases to tools to allow people to navigate data, in some cases for more narrative forms, for example, of exposition of ideas. I think that's important partly because it can be really impactful for policymakers. As researchers, we tend to like to consume research. It's what we do, it's what we're used to. This is often not the case for policymakers, and actually thinking a little bit about what output will be most convincing is really important. So at Nesta, we did a lot of work with narratives, with creative writing as an output, based on research, based on fundamentally sound research inputs, but using those as ways to communicate our messages. At the same time, I think one of the really interesting things around a lot of data-driven research at the moment is creating tools that people can themselves play with. And for example, the mantra of Open Innovations in Leeds, who I mentioned earlier, is that they don't create reports. Reports is the absolute thing they don't do. And they've produced a lot of really interesting either apps to allow people to do things directly or tools to allow people to navigate the data that they produce and analyse in their own ways. I think that can be incredibly effective in dealing with policymakers. The fourth thing I was going to talk about is theory of mind, which to me sometimes is one of the hardest things to get right as a researcher. How to put yourself in the mind of your audience for your research, who will not have your level of expertise, your level of understanding, or potentially your level of research skill, but often nevertheless is perfectly intelligent, will know a bunch of things that we don't know, and needs to be brought along in an effective way. So understanding what that user need is. What is something that your audience is going to view as trivially true? What's your audience going to view as something that's genuinely insightful? What's something they're going to view as interesting but not directly relevant to what they do? One of the reasons why I think policy fellowships and other people exchange schemes are so important is not because they allow the sort of positive transfer of knowledge, but because they allow the transfer of ignorance, the transfer of awareness of what other people are not aware of, which is such a difficult thing to recreate. Understanding what is going to be surprising to a policymaker, so challenging, so tricky. And when I think about economists, I suppose the discipline I'm closest to, it's absolutely eye-opening to see the number of very, very, very intelligent, gifted economists who have a very good understanding of policy from an economic point of view, but who perhaps have a less good understanding of what policymakers immediately accept, what they abreact to, and what they feel they need significant convincing on. That's partly because disciplines have their own cultures in which things are strong, and it's partly because it's just very difficult to get into the heads of other people. But being able to do that is so important to achieving impact. And then finally, I wanted to talk about diversity. Diversity is obviously a value that we all support from a moral point of view. It's incredibly important in terms of fairness and the kind of society we want to create. I think it's also important from the point of view of actually achieving policy impact. And I think there are three ways in which this applies. Personal diversity, so diversity of protected characteristics, of background, is, I would hardly need to tell this audience, incredibly important for bringing diversity of perspective, bringing an understanding of different communities, especially to policy contexts that are often not very diverse. So that is, having a diverse social research workforce is as well as being morally justified, instrumentally useful from that point of view. I think in addition to that, there is a really important need for institutional diversity when it comes to social research as well. And I say this as an organisation that primarily funds universities, so one type of institution. What I would say is I observe a huge benefit to the fact that we have lots of types of organisations doing social research, not all of which are universities and not all of which are the same type of universities. It's something that has been remarked on for at least 30 years, that of all the ESRC's different investments, the one that in some ways is most impactful is the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is probably the main non-university institution that we fund. And I think there's some interesting things about the actual institutional structure of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and for other organisations that is really valuable. It's very valuable that they are different from being a university. And having that diversity, I think, is quite important from an impact point of view. I think it has an effect on some of these things. It has an effect on their understanding of the people they're talking to, has an effect on timeliness and rigour. There is very different, the editorial process in a think tank or in other types of non-governmental, non-university organisation works differently from the, I mean, I wouldn't even describe it as an editorial process, but there's obviously a different quality control process in academia based on peer review and based on departmental structures. But having those different processes, I think, is really valuable from that point of view. And then finally, the difference of having a range of ideological perspectives, I think, is really important as well. And there's a really interesting case study that I saw, it's been being discussed a bit recently, but I saw it picked up by the economist and blogger Noah Smith today, really interestingly, about US maternal mortality statistics, which some of you will be aware of this debate, where there was a long-standing observation that US maternal mortality had been on a kind of very alarming upward trend for, I believe, about 15 years. And then subsequent research had found that actually it was very likely that this upward trend was an artifact of the way data were being reported. Effectively, various states were changing their their statistical definitions, and because they were changing them in different orders, each one increased the rate, so it looked like an upward trend, whereas actually the underlying trend was downwards. And the observation that people made about this debate was that it only got revealed because actually there were a whole bunch of people from different perspectives talking about what was going on. It had persisted quite a long time because it had only really, the observation had only really been commented on in a relatively constrained circle of people working specifically on maternal mortality. So it's really interesting to sort of to add that idea about the different types of diversity, I think, that we want to observe, and diversity of people, institutional diversity, and diversity of viewpoint in what we do, I think, is really important. I'm coming towards the end of my time, but I did just want to give a reflection on why I think all of these things are so important. And it is timely to do this at a time when the power of social research is borne out by the huge amount of debate we see around the political choices we face and around the election. I'm really thrilled to see political scientists, sociologists, economists weighing in, not just with research at the cutting edge, at the technological frontier, but also about commentary on the direction of the country, what they think we should be thinking, and how that affects our political choices. I know this work will go on after the election, and that social researchers will have an absolutely vital role to play in informing policy choices. And I am really energized to see an audience of social researchers so attached to that question. Thank you. Got some time for questions now, but it's really been really great to talk to you about this.
Thanks so much, Stian. Really wide-ranging, huge number of things you've covered there. We've got some questions coming through. Don't hold back in posting them up on Hoover. We've got more than 5 minutes now. The first couple, let's do a couple first. You mentioned format as a key principle for impact. But the question from the audience is, how can we convince departments to include the time for sharing and networking those outputs within and between institutions?
So this is clearly a challenge. You know, we can only do what can be funded and what there's time for. I think one of the most effective ways of trying to make that case is to show examples of where alternative formats have been really impactful. So I know one of the reasons why one of the departments I work with was willing to invest in building various tools is they'd seen the effectiveness of mapping tools, for example, for doing some, I shouldn't be specific, but doing some mapping of various economic phenomena. They'd seen how well received they were. And so I think this is partly a question of just sort of saying, this will help you increase the traction that your research has. I think there is obviously a challenge that all of these things require the right skills. They require skills to build the tools and so forth. So this is the more that you do, the easier it gets to make the case for doing more.
Thank you. Interesting one about local place-based approaches, which you touched on, and as we know, are sort of increasing in interest. They are becoming more important. What else do you see maybe changing in the next few years?
From a place-based point of view, or generally?
I think that's the idea.
Okay.
Maybe we could start with as place-based approaches increase.
Okay. So, I mean, I think one thing that we all know, and I think that keeps coming up, is that the more people make use of social research in policy making, the more comfortable they get with it, the greater their absorptive capacity is. And I think that's something that I would expect to see a lot of in metropolitan combined authorities or other place-based institutions, that there will be a learning curve. There will be some projects that they don't feel are effective or that don't work. And at the same time, that successful projects give an infrastructure to build on, especially when we're talking about data. Data, you know, data infrastructure is really valuable for that point of view. So I think we'll see a growing sophistication in terms of people's willingness to commission and to consume that research. I would imagine we will see more in-house production of knowledge. I mean, this stuff takes time to scale up internally, and it takes resourcing. And I'd like to think we'll see more localised production as well, more local capacity to produce things.
Fantastic. I think a suggestion here in response to the question on how to encourage other kinds of outputs. Somebody said, could UKRI work with the REF to encourage other outputs than articles to be fully valued? Yes,
so this is I think this is really important. And one of the things you'll know that we're working on the 2029 REF at the moment. And one of the elements of the REF at the moment is the people, culture and environment element, which is the aim is to increase the importance of that. I think a really important aspect of people, culture and environment is alternative research outputs. And not everything needs to be a highly cited paper. So the production tools, the production of data, making sure that people are rewarded for doing that, I think is really important for where we want to go in REF 29.
Thank you. Speaking to the timeliness point, people want to know, how do we address the increasing bureaucracy of DPIAs that prevent us from commissioning research speedily?
So I think this is bureaucracy and timeliness in general is it's a sort of ongoing battle. You know, you kind of have to hack away at things, and bureaucracy will have a tendency to increase unless the countervailing force is greater. I know, for example, there's been some really good work that has been done in our bit of the world to reduce the onerousness of business cases on a lot of R&D processes. I think it's a really important question of how we can spread that knowledge in research commissioning across government. And my understanding is that this is one of the things that the Government Office of Science and the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, Angela McLean, have really been thinking about how to make these commissioning processes work better.
I might ask a question linked to commissioning. So, you know, we talked about mission-driven approaches and their increasing prominence. And they may necessarily be cross-departmental. We also talked about the number of ARAs that government departments have got and the effort it takes to see across them. So, you know, would anything need to change in the way that research is commissioned and used to help government departments better align with missions? Is the way that they are set up incentivising and enabling that, or would something need to shift?
So I think this is definitely a work in progress. I actually asked this question to Alex Chisholm, Cabinet Office Perm Secretary, when he did a sort of valedictory lecture a while ago, and I think he effectively sort of said, he gave a very good answer, as you would hope from Permanent Secretary, but he basically said, we're working on it, we're thinking about it. But this is obviously a really old problem. We all know why you need to have government departments, because you need some kind of manageable unit, and being based on responsibilities is probably a sensible way of doing it, but obviously there are things that will go across government departments. I think it'd be interesting to see how that challenge gets tackled. I can imagine some things will be doable within departments. You can just divide up the pie. There may be some kind of coordination function. I think there's an interesting question about whether you would have any cross-cutting commissioning. I imagine that doing that would probably involve quite a lot of friction. So I don't quite know where that will end up.
Fantastic. Well, we've come to the end of our time, Stian, but thank you so much for setting the tone for the conference. Lots and lots of issues that we've explored there. Really appreciate it. Let's all thank Stian.